When the guns fell silent in April of 1865, the United States faced a new question: how to rebuild a nation that had been shattered by civil war, and how to define freedom now for the first time for 4 million people who had just been emancipated from slavery. Hence, Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the nation's first great experiment in interracial democracy, and ultimately, its abject failure is going to shape American society for generations and to an extent still impacts us today. So, today I'm going to give a brief overview of the era of Reconstruction, and then we'll later on go into more detailed topics. So, we have to, of course, begin with the elephant in the room, and that is that prior to the end of the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, who's generally listed as the best president in American history, was assassinated. This left the task of Reconstruction to his successor, Andrew Johnson, a Democrat from southern Tennessee, and someone who was, quite frankly, an afterthought. He was only added onto the ticket with Lincoln to try to bolster support from some of the border states during the Civil War. Now, Lincoln had spoken of the idea of malice towards none and charity towards all. But Johnson's approach was lenient towards former Confederates. He granted broad pardons to Southern leaders and allowed state governments to form quickly, many of which promptly passed what are called black codes. Black codes were laws designed to immediately restrict the rights of newly freed African Americans. These codes limited freedom of movement, labor contracts, and access to court, effectively preserving a system that was very similar to chattel slavery. Now, in response, Congress, led by the radical Republicans such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, launched their own plan for Reconstruction. They sought to guarantee civil and political rights for freed people and to fundamentally transform Southern society. Now, Johnson is going to run up against these radical Republicans. And as a consequence, he is going to become the first president in history to be impeached, though not removed, short by one vote. But that'll be the subject of the next lecture. It is important to note that during this period in American history, three of the most consequential, particularly one of them, amendments to the United States Constitution are passed. We have the 13th and 15th, which were both sort of pro forma and required if you're going to have anything close to equality. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery with a caveat we'll come back to later on in this semester, which is except for punishment as a crime, which turned out to be a rather large loophole. And then there's the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the right to vote, essentially based on race or skin color. What this did was it allowed suffrage for all African American males. Now, you may recall from previous lectures that there was a lot of linkage between the feminist movement and the abolitionist movement in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Feminists were disappointed that the 15th Amendment did not include the right for women to vote, and in fact, they were going to have to wait a bit. The most important amendment that comes out of the Reconstruction period, though, is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is one of the most pivotal amendments for understanding how American society is going to change in the decades after the Civil War, and particularly as we get into the Civil Rights Movement, because it does two huge things. First, this is the Birthright Citizenship Amendment. So, this is talked about a lot in American society today. But essentially, what it did was it naturalized all persons born in the United States. Well, why? Well, there's a historical reason for this. And the reason is of course, technically, up until emancipation, all of those African Americans toiling under the lash of slavery were not citizens. And radical Republicans could very easily foresee a strategy by Southern Democrats to simply say, well, we don't have to give African Americans the right to vote because they're not citizens. So they took care of this by simply declaring blanket provision that, look, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen, and that's it. And that's what politicians today are still arguing over, even though that is the plain language. Now, the second part of this amendment is actually more important because this is the Equal Protection Amendment. And I know that sounds obvious, but the reality is up until the 14th Amendment, you could make the legal argument that all the protections in the Constitution, right to free speech, right to bear arms, right to due process, all of those things only applied in federal situations. So they only applied in federal courts, and only the federal government was prohibited from passing laws, let's say, restricting your right to free speech. What the 14th Amendment does is it says, okay, all of those rights, they apply to the states now too, just unequivocally. States have to follow them. Now, at the time, this was intended again to prohibit Southern states from passing laws restricting the right to free speech, let's say for African Americans, or the right to petition the government, taking that away from African Americans. However, what it effectively means now is that the federal government gains a little bit more power over the states. And now the states have to comply with federal laws, which are passed. And that really changes the dynamics in ways that we're going to talk about a lot when we get into the 20th century. All right. So, what happens next? Well, of course, Southern states are going to resist congressional mandates. And as a consequence, Congress and now the radical Republicans, they take over from President Johnson. And so now we go into the period that's called radical Reconstruction. And what they effectively do is they place the former Confederacy under military rule. They divide up the South into military districts, and they put a military governor in charge of each district. So you essentially now have the North dominating the South. They do this through the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. There are 5 military districts, each overseen by a Union general. Now, to get their representation back into Congress and to end military reconstruction, states had to do 2 things. They had to draft new constitutions guaranteeing black male suffrage, and they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And some did this quickly, some took a long time. Now, under radical Reconstruction, for a brief period, democracy actually did flourish in the South. Black men voted, they held office, and they helped states rewrite their constitutions. In fact, by 1870, there were more than 600 African Americans in state legislatures and 16 in Congress, including Hiram Revels of Mississippi, the first black U.S. senator. Churches and social organizations and schools emerged across the South under the leadership of freed people and the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was established by the federal government to assist with education, labor contracts, and welfare for freed slaves. So, for a brief period, it worked, but there was resistance. White resistance was fierce and often violent. Paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1866, used terror to suppress black political participation. Freedmen who voted Republican or sought to exercise their rights at all faced beatings, lynchings, and arson. Despite federal laws like the Enforcement Acts passed in 1870 1871, which authorized military intervention against the Klan, the violence persisted. Economic freedom was also elusive. Most freed people became sharecroppers. Sharecroppers essentially rented land in exchange for a portion of their harvests, a system that trapped many families, including poor white families, in perpetual debt. It was a system that wasn't that far away economically from slavery. It was very easy for the wealthy landowners to simply set the rent for the land at a rate that always kept the farmer behind the 8 ball. They could never get out of debt, which means they could never buy their own land and they could never advance their position. And to a large extent, this system of quasi slavery affected poor whites as well as poor blacks. Land reform efforts, including the famous promise Sherman made of 40 acres and a mule, were largely abandoned by the early 1870s, and the dream of widespread land ownership for blacks withered on the vine. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, the former Union general, took the presidency in March of 1869. And he entered the presidency as a symbol of national unity and victory, though this will change. His reputation as the general who defeated the Confederacy and preserve the Union gave him immense prestige. But as he would soon discover, winning the peace required a very different kind of generalship. The Grant presidency became a struggle to defend Reconstruction, root out corruption, and define the role of a federal government that was increasingly turning different in the face of rapid industrialization and political division, which emerged almost as quickly as it went away after the Civil War. Look, Grant wasn't a politician by temperament. He was shy, modest, and loyal to a fault. He had never held elected office before the presidency. His campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," captured the public's longing for stability after years of war and turmoil. But beneath the calm surface, the country was bitterly divided. The South continued to seethe under Reconstruction governments, while the North grew restless with the cost of maintaining the system and rebuilding the Union. The Republican Party, dominant since the Civil War, was starting to fracture. Radical Republicans demanded continued military occupation of the South and full protection of black civil rights. Moderate conservative Republicans, however, wanted reconciliation with the South and a return to economic growth. Grant tried to navigate these competing factions, often trusting personal loyalty more than political calculation, which is going to haunt him later on. So Grant entered office determined to secure the civil and political rights of formerly enslaved persons. He worked very closely with the radical Republicans in Congress to enforce Reconstruction laws and protect freed people from white supremacists and violence. Under his leadership, Congress did pass several landmark pieces of legislation. They did pass the 15th Amendment in 1870, guaranteeing the right to vote for black males. As I mentioned, they passed the Enforcement Acts, which authorized federal supervision of elections and the use of U.S. troops to suppress groups like the Klan. They also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which is the first Civil Rights Act legislation passed in the United States. This sought to guarantee equal access to public accommodations, though it would be short lived. Grant used the full power of the presidency to combat terrorism in the South. He suspended the right to habeas corpus, which is to petition to essentially ask a judge to review the conditions of your incarceration. And he did that in parts of South Carolina in 1871 so that he could arrest hundreds of Klan members. His firm action actually broke the first Ku Klux Klan, though white resistance would soon reemerge in different forms. Despite these efforts, Reconstruction began to quickly lose political support. Many white Northerners just got tired of sending troops south, and racist attitudes quickly hardened across the nation. Grant's commitment to civil rights remained strong, but as the 1870s progressed, his political capital quickly eroded. And of course, he's the president, so he can't just deal with domestic issues. Grant's foreign policy was cautious but ambitious in vision. His Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, restored diplomatic respect after the chaos of what had been Andrew Johnson's administration. Together, they negotiated the Treaty of Washington in 1871 with Great Britain, which peacefully resolved long standing disputes all the way from the Civil War era. The British agreed to pay the US 15.5 million in damages caused by Confederate warships that had been built in British shipping yards, which was a huge diplomatic triumph. Grant actually also pursued the annexation of Santo Domingo, which is the Dominican Republic today. He thought maybe that could be a potential haven for African Americans and even give the United States a foothold in the Caribbean. Now, of course, the plan failed when the Senate rejected it, which exposed deep racial and imperial divisions within the Republican Party, but it was an interesting effort nonetheless. Still, Grant's administration's handling of the Washington Treaty and other peaceful resolutions reflected a new and broader trend for the United States, and that is that the U.S. was emerging as a respected international power, confident and cautious in its ambitions, but had them nonetheless. Now, Grant presided over a nation entering into what is called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is actually a term that is coined by Mark Twain, of all people. For something to be gilded, it essentially means that it's covered with the veneer of a precious metal, usually gold. But if you chip away at it, it's wood or, iron or something underneath. It's a period of vast industrial expansion, railroad building, and corporate influence. But an era in which there was massive inequalities and rampant political corruption. Ultimately, Grant's policies generally favored hard money and fiscal conservatism. In 1873, he signed the Coinage Act, which effectively placed the US on the gold standard. The gold standard meaning that essentially the United States can only issue as much currency, so as much paper money, as we could back up with gold. What that does is it puts a cap on the amount of money that you can print, which in effect should keep inflation down, but also makes it very, very difficult for debtors to repay their loans. This decision, of course, pleased the bankers, but angered farmers and debtors, who called it the crime of 73. Unfortunately for Grant, that very same year, the panic, or we would say recession today, of 1873 triggered a severe economic downturn. Banks collapsed, railroads failed, and unemployment soared. The crisis exposed the weakness of unregulated capitalism and undermined public confidence in the Republican Party. As unemployment riots shook northern cities, Democrats gained ground, portraying Republicans as the party of Wall Street and corruption. No aspect of Grant's presidency attracted more criticism, though, than the scandals that engulfed it. Though personally honest, Grant had once remarked, "I have never knowingly permitted any man to hold office under me who was corrupt." He, unfortunately, often appointed friends and loyalists whose integrity was questionable at best. The first major scandal came in 1869 when the gold ring speculators like Jay Gould and James Fisk tried to corner the gold market. They manipulated access to the president through his brother in law. And when Grant realized what was happening, he ordered the Treasury to sell gold, causing prices to crash and sparking a financial panic. This was unfortunately only one scandal. There was also the Credit Mobilier scandal in 1872, which involved members of Congress taking bribes from a railroad construction company. There was the Whiskey Ring scandal in 1875 that saw Treasury officials and distillers conspiring to cheat the government out of its own taxes. When Grant's own private secretary, Orville Babcock, was implicated, Grant's defense of "let no guilty man escape if it can be avoided" rang hollow. And there was the Indian Ring corruption scandal that involved corrupt agents defrauding Native American tribes under the supervision of the very Secretary of War who was in charge of them, and he had to resign under a threat of impeachment. All of these scandals, in and of themselves, are not necessarily things that have to be memorized. What we need to understand here is the overall tenor of the administration. And as we get into the Gilded Age more later on, you'll understand that corruption was a part of the fact that business was booming in the United States. Everyone was looking to make easy money, and it was very easy for politicians to line their pockets. Reform is coming, but it certainly wasn't coming in the Grant administration. By 1872, a faction of reform minded Republicans calling themselves the Liberal Republicans finally broke away from the party. Led by the journalist Horace Greeley, they denounced corruption, calling for civil service reform and demanded an end to military reconstruction in the South. Democrats, sensing an opportunity, endorsed Greeley as their own candidate for election. Now, Grant would win re election in a landslide, but the defection of a portion of his own political party revealed growing disillusionment within the Republican ranks. Even his victory could not restore the moral authority that had surrounded his first term. In his second term, Grant's political power weakened further. Northern interest in Reconstruction effectively collapsed after the Panic of 1873 and economic hardship. Southern Democrats, who called themselves redeemers, used violence and voter repression to regain control of state governments. Federal troops, stretched thin across the South and increasingly unwelcome, couldn't stem the tide. And as we'll see next time, in the election of 1876, Reconstruction would meet an ignoble end.